Good day, ladies and gentlemen. My name is David J. Baldwin. I am a retired FBI agent. What follows is a video interview of Philip Haney, the now deceased founding member of the U.S. Department of Homeland Security that I conducted in July 2019. I came to know Philip Haney personally in what would be the last year of his life. I met him at a national security summit. He and his story, as related personally, and his deep and insightful knowledge of Islam made such an impression on me that I reached out to him and he agreed to an interview. What you will view is part one of a two-part interview. This interview is about Islam, the Muslim Brotherhood, and the global Islamic Jihad movement, and its effect on and subversion of our government. It is a national security issue. Philip was a scientist by trade. He was an entomologist. He worked in the Middle East in that capacity, which is what allowed him to become so knowledgeable of the culture. Philip's body was found on the side of a road in Amador County, California, on February 21st of 2020, near where he lived, with a gunshot wound to his chest. There are those who feel that he was murdered, while others are skeptical of this. Philip was a man of deep Christian faith. He was unique, witty, with a dry sense of humor. He was an American patriot and the author of See Something, Say Nothing. A Homeland Security officer exposes the government's submission to jihad. One of Philip's claims or assertions was that the information he and some of his colleagues developed about jihadis might have prevented both the San Bernardino attack and the Orlando Pulse nightclub attack. Our own government, however, turned on him and other patriots who were trying to protect America and its citizens. Members of our own government went after Phil Haney and others like him for doing their duties, fulfilling their oaths of office in what, in my opinion, were acts of treachery and betrayal. Unfortunately, ladies and gentlemen, this betrayal of Phil Haney and America is nothing new. This government's betrayal of its own citizens goes back decades, as has been well researched and documented by various researchers and authors. One such was William J. Gill, who wrote The Ordeal of Otto Otepka, about the Kennedy administration investigation of and persecution of Otto Otepka, a security officer with the Department of State who was doing his job of trying to investigate communist subversion of our government. Otepka's diligence stood in the way of some in our government who sought to converge us with communism, according to Gill. Otepka sought to unravel the cultural Marxist red thread that was in the relatively early stages of being woven into our government fabric. I would submit that we are seeing the results of that ongoing convergence to this very day. By the time Phil Haney and others came along, that red thread within our government agencies, including the FBI, had become interwoven with the green Muslim Brotherhood thread. That is the combined enemy within that Phil Haney confronted. It is the enemy that we as American citizens face. After the September 11 jihadi attacks on the World Trade Center, Phil Haney approached then Georgia Senator Max Cleland and told him he thought he could help his beloved country. This is what propelled him to be one of the founding members of the DHS. I have read that with knowledge comes responsibility. Phil Haney shared his knowledge. I would like to take the opportunity on the anniversary of his death to share Phil Haney's knowledge with you. Without further ado, I offer an edited full-length interview, part one, with Philip Haney. I want to thank those who helped me with this presentation. I would also be remiss if I did not thank my many mentors over the past years regarding this subject matter. You all know who you are. How did Phil Haney come to be a founding member of the U.S. Department of Homeland Security?
Well, as with many of us, it had to do with 9/11. And all this time I had already spent in the Middle East studying agriculture, but also learning language and studying theology. I studied the Quranic Arabic, studied the theology of Islam with not from the terrorists, from the perspective of their warfare doctrine, but more on a broad base of apologetics, comparing biblical theology to Quranic theology, because I spent so much time there on the ground with people that would go into spasms of hysteria when we brought up the country with the flag there behind my head, or even the foreign policy of the other country with the flag there with the red and white stripes. These people would go into a state of hysteria that was astonishing to see. These are grown-up people our age, my age, colleagues that I work with in the field. And if we ever did get to the subject where we started talking about current events in the Middle East, these people transformed into it was obvious that they had very passionate, deep-held beliefs. Where did this all come from? What were they basing these feelings and these statements and these beliefs on? Well, it wasn't the weather. It wasn't the geography. It wasn't the place where they were at physically in the world. It was obviously something much deeper than that. It didn't come from the kind of drinks that what they were drinking. It wasn't that. It was obvious. It had to do coming from here in the heart. And where did this worldview come from? Well, it was pretty plain. It was coming from the Quran. And like any investigator, if you're pursuing developing a case, you don't rule out any pieces of information, do you? You don't just say, I'm going to ignore that because it doesn't fit with what my preconceived criteria of this case are. No, you just make them on the clipboard, so to speak, and you start keeping track of this new variable, if you want to put it that way, this thing you didn't really know about before. That's a good researcher, and that's a good scientist too. If you bias yourself by insisting that you're not going to pay attention to these newly emerging variables, you're really not a good scientist, and you're not really a good law enforcement officer either. You're already letting your biases like a bulldozer plow right through the case, and you'll miss a lot. You may never solve a good case because there's always variables that appear along the way that end up being like the keys that open the door to the case. And most of the time, at least half, you're not aware of them initially. Right. And as you work your way through the sequence of events that lead you to that moment, that when that picture emerges out of the fog, so to speak, like a ship coming out of the fog on the water, and when that moment, when it becomes clear to you, there's a lot of variables, some of them that are obvious, but a lot of them are not so obvious. It's that way in law enforcement, and it's that way in science too. So when you hear the argument that these are lone wolves, and that it has nothing whatsoever to do with Islam, that is, I'm sorry, I'm lost for words of how absurd that all is, because
would pathological be a good description?
It's a kind of a willful blindness. It's a delusion on anyone's part that claims that these individuals have no connection with the social structure. If you know anything about Islam, you realize that they of all communities are desperate. It's life and death for them to maintain a connection with the greater community called the Ummah. I mean, it's the same word as mother. Islam. See, Islam is a religion of salam if you aslam. It's all play on the same root word. Islam is a religion of salam, peace, if you aslam, if you submit. There has to be an underlying deeper psychological reason why people will kill themselves and others to establish this law. And we have to be able to understand in the deepest possible intimate way, if you will, what is actually the deeper motivation for them doing all of this. It's because it's the only sense of order there is in this world that we live in. There are no other substitutes for it. That's why when they immigrate to a new community, oftentimes they become more Sharia compliant than they were back home. And I said earlier that if you study behavior enough of individuals and organizations, you can't necessarily put an exact mathematical quantity on it, but there's no calculus for that. But there is a calculus for being able to foresee in a general sense, based on the evidence at hand, that, for example, in the Asian subcontinent, Pakistan, Afghanistan, India, Bangladesh, and Myanmar, that there's going to be an ever-evolving, increasing number of jihad terror attacks going forward. And I mean that. I'm not using that as an abstract. This is going to happen. It's already begun. Sri Lanka. Why? Because they published a thing called the Code of Conduct, which is a synonym for Fi Sabil Allah, the way of Allah. It's called Code of Conduct. They published it in English. It's a 20-page document. Outline the strategy and tactics of the Al-Qaeda of the Indian subcontinent, their goals and the ways they're going to accomplish it. It's just as significant as a document that a lot of us have heard about called the Explanatory Memorandum that was written by the Muslim Brotherhood for North America. And here's an important distinction. It's like a species and a subspecies. We hear all the time, daily, Al-Qaeda, Islamic State, Muslim Brotherhood, Hamas, and so on, right? Those are the Arab-speaking branch of the global Islamic movement. It came to light when Osama bin Laden and 4 other well-known, globally renowned sheikhs formed a coalition called the Global Jihad Front, or the Global Islamic Front. And we still seem to be so myopic. We don't seem to realize that it wasn't just Osama bin Laden. There was 4 other individuals, prominent global level individuals, who formed this coalition called a Jamaat. But there's something even more significant that we have also overlooked, apparently. That along with these 5 individuals, of whom Osama bin Laden is the most prominent, there were also 14 other global level organizations that joined in partnership in this coalition and did what is called Bayat, pledged allegiance to these 5 sheikhs. Would you like to guess, friend, how many of those 14 global level organizations were not from the Arabic speaking side of the equation of the global Islamic movement, but were from the Pashtun Urdu Indian subcontinent side of the equation? 7 of the 14. Meanwhile, over there in a place called Afghanistan, there was another branch, another plant emerging up out of the ground, led by these 5 individuals. And their whole purpose was to establish an Islamic caliphate based on Sharia law in a country that would be basically like a clean slate called Afghanistan, where it was chaotic and disconnected and disorganized, and they were going to go in and show the world how to set up an Islamic caliphate in this wild land called Afghanistan, and more or less did it. But in the process, my point taken a while to get to it, is that in all the years that we've been hearing about Al Qaeda and Islamic State and so on, we have completely blinded ourselves or been myopic to the fact that half of the entire coalition is based in the Indian subcontinent, not in the near Middle East, in the Indian subcontinent, the far Middle East, Asia. And the organization is called the Deobandi, the Tablighi Jamaat, the Lashkar-e-Taiba, and another one that we've all heard about, the Taliban. And even when we read the news stories about Americans who say they wanted to go over to the Middle East to help ISIS, we seem to not realize that what they also say in the next breath is that they wanted to go and fight with the Taliban. Well, wait a minute. The Taliban are not Arab speaking. They're Pashtun Urdu. They are the ground soldiers of the global Islamic movement, even though it was originated by some prominent Arab-speaking sheikhs. 2 or 3 of the 5 originals were Pashtun Urdu. And somehow we've completely missed the fact that there's these 2 gigantic branches of Islam that have coalesced into one. And so now, why does that all matter? Because my chain of command, when I was active duty, destroyed the cases that I had put together with colleagues at the National Targeting Center that would have prepared us to look and see that that trend was emerging on the horizon. They destroyed them. They destroyed the cases, and then that wasn't enough. As you intimated when you first started the whole program, it wasn't enough to simply, first of all, ignore the information, which they tried to do initially, but then they had to go to the next step and destroy it. But that wasn't really enough for them then, because somehow or another that streak of animosity and vindictiveness that they had, they took it out on their own countrymen. They came after the people like me who put the information into the system in the first place, because it contradicted their enlightened view of foreign policy. And we were troublemakers, and we had to be eliminated. And they came after us. And that's why I call it invisible shrapnel. They basically tossed grenades into the living room of our homes and lives, and they blew us apart. I don't mean arms flying and body parts. I mean from the inside out. They blew our lives apart.
Now, who besides Phil Haney, how many others and how many agencies with folks like yourself that were there at that time trying to do the work?
In your agency, Bill Gothrop.
Pardon?
In your agency, it was Bill Gothrop. There was really only 1 or 2 of individuals who were like the most, had the deepest background and the most experience in this area. And in the FBI, it was Bill Gothrop, also Stephen Coughlin, who was, well, he contracted with the Department of State and with the military.
Right.
And then there was John Guandola, who was with the FBI also. And then there was Matthew Dooley from the Department of Defense. And then myself. You might toss in, I think his name is John Dalton. He wrote the book on Fast and Furious. He was also with the FBI. I think he was with JTTF Task Force out of Phoenix. And he wrote the book on the Fast and Furious fiasco. But we're going back earlier than Fast and Furious. We're going back 06, 07, 08, 09 in that area. And you also mentioned that there was an earlier Great Purge, and there was. It actually started in the year 2009. When they went in and forced the deletion and alteration of about 820 records out of the classified law enforcement database, specifically on the Muslim Brotherhood. So the first one to go was the Muslim Brotherhood indicators. And then a few years later, in 12, right during the height of the Great Purge, is when they destroyed the cases on the Deobandi network, what I call the Madrasa boys, and what I talk about in the book. But that's the other branch of Islam that I've been spending so much time building this whole story. You have to put it in context. Two large branches. It so happened that in my capacity, I had the wherewithal to see that the two major trends in the threat of global Islam or global jihad happened to be under the umbrella of the Arabic-speaking Ikhwan, the Muslim Brotherhood in the West primarily, and the Pashtun Urdu-speaking Deobandi movement coming out of the heart of the Indian subcontinent. And that they were working actually literally under the same coalition, which at the time was called the Global Jihad Front, but we all know of it as by another name, which they never called themselves, Al-Qaeda. Now guess where the term Al-Qaeda came from?
I think I've read it, but go ahead and inform me and your audience again.
The explanatory memorandum. In the first paragraph of the first page, it talks about mobilizing the observant Muslim base.
Okay.
And in the Arabic, that is Al-Mutsima Al-Islami Al-Qaeda. The concept of Al-Qaeda was formalized by the Muslim Brotherhood in the explanatory memorandum. It was not a new concept. The very first Al-Qaeda was actually Medina under Muhammad. Al-Qaeda is not a thing, it's a concept. And we have it in our political system. We call it, we're appealing to the base. To the Republicans, they appeal to their base. The Democrats appeal to their base. Is there an office somewhere in Tennessee where you can go to the state capitol and knock on room 237 and say, I'd like to meet the leader of the base? No, because it's an abstract concept. There is one. There is a base, but it's not an organization. It's a concept. And it's just the same with what we call Al-Qaeda. They never called themselves that. They call themselves exactly what they are, the Global Jihad Front. But what happened over time, especially under Obama, is that he changed the rules and forced us into the probable cause arena. And if you don't have probable cause, you can't ask people questions like you can if you're with mere suspicion. And so it's a deadly spiral, fatal crash. You're dead in the water. There's no way that you can ask people the kind of questions that the 5 W's that we call it, who, what, where, when, and why, if you're not allowed to ask them the questions. And believe me, the Muslim Brotherhood individuals that Obama formed alliances in caught on to that real quick. And they began a barrage of lawsuits and grievances and complaints that took right up to the chain of command into the Civil Rights and Civil Liberties branch of Department of Homeland Security called CRCL and shut us down. They came after officers that were conducting interviews at the border crossing point. When people come into the airport with their passport and lay it on the counter, and you say, hello, sir, what's the purpose of your trip? Where are you going? Who are you staying with? Who will you be visiting? Oh, you can't ask that question. I don't have to answer that question. Obama says so. And that's a really simplified way of explaining the difference between mere suspicion, indicators, and dots. And as I said earlier, it wasn't enough just to prevent us from doing that part. Then they went in and started deleting and eliminating the information that we'd already accumulated in the classified database, and basically punched a hole like a tank right through the wall of law enforcement. Or if you want to put it another way, it's like a black hole in space. And as time went on, that hole got bigger and bigger and bigger. But it amplified in double speed, because not only was the information that would have given us a historical database background for conducting subsequent informations destroyed, So we had no compass point. They wouldn't allow us to put anything new into the system. There were people that were already inside. Most of the force of gravity came out of the State Department because they've been pro-Arab, pro-Palestinian forever. And they kept blocking our efforts to develop cases. And so by the time it got to the Tablighi Jamaat case and the Deobandi case that I was working on at the National Targeting Center in 11 and 12, right in the midst of the Great Purge, they literally had the audacity to come to the National Targeting Center in Reston, Virginia, and tell us to our face that they had concerns about our focus on this group called Tablighi Jamaat. They had concerns. We're law enforcement. They're in an entirely different branch of government, and they're actually literally coming over to this preeminent center of intelligence for DHS and telling us to our face they don't like the fact that we're focusing on this particular group called Tablighi Jamaat, saying that the Muslim Brotherhood intend to do exactly what they say in the explanatory memorandum, and for saying that the Tablighi Jamaat intend to do exactly what they declare over and over: to subvert, saturate from the bottom up, or from terrorism from the top down, and implement Sharia everywhere in the world that they can. And for that, I was accused of violating their civil rights and civil liberties for implying that a person who belongs to Tablighi Jamaat or to Muslim Brotherhood might actually be a terrorist. See, we were not even allowed to make those connections. Even the FBI in 2012 put out a guideline that said your agency, I guess after you retired, that even though a person is part of a known terrorist organization, you're not allowed to assume that he himself might be a terrorist. That's how bad it got. And so why did I bring that up? Because I wrote this book before they became so prominently well known on the national level. And the reason that they did is they made the decision, the tactical decision, to come out into the open and go after President Trump.
Right.
But they sharpened their knives on people like me. They were doing the same kind of extra-legal violation of due process kind of investigations with people like me that they did in broad daylight with Trump. And they overplayed their hand. They destroyed a lot of people's lives. And Mueller and Brennan are both involved in the Great Purge. They're both involved in the bringing of the Muslim Brotherhood right into the inner circles of the executive branch of the government.
Right.
They're both involved in giving awards and rewards. The FBI was giving Muslim Brotherhood leaders commendation awards, while guys like me were doing our best to bring the notice of their behavior and activity to the law enforcement attention. They just destroyed it. See, they can't be allowing officers to put derogatory information in a classified database while they're giving the same people commendation awards and positions on major policy committees like the Steering Committee for the Countering Violent Extremism Program, for example, one of many examples, or 150 meetings at the White House with individuals from Muslim Public Affairs or CARE or ISNA. Known fronts for the Muslim Brotherhood, and then I can hear the voices. Well, what do you mean, Mr. Haney? There you go again, exaggerating. What do you mean they were known? And this is a really important point in the interview and the story. The reason why it was known is called the Holy Land Foundation trial, which was successfully concluded in November of 2008, exactly the same month that we had an election. And that is really the turning point of our country's national security policy, was that month. Why? Because at that point, the newly elected president could have followed through and gone forward in the law enforcement arena and really shut those organizations down once and for all. But what did they do instead? The exact opposite.
Right.
And so in order to do that, to follow through with it, they had to start getting rid of the pesky evidence, didn't they? And that's what put me right in the middle of this incredible story, is that of all the officers in the whole agency, I probably had, by several factors, 3, 4, 5, 10 times more records in the system than anybody else on the Muslim Brotherhood. And it all goes back to my previous experience working in the Middle East and being familiar with seeing these guys up close and personal in real life and knowing who they were. It wasn't theoretical for me ever. And so because of that, I found myself in the crosshairs of the administration. And they did everything they possibly could to ignore first, and then delete second, and then destroy third, the life and career of the people that put that information into the system, so that they would have no accountability in what they did.
You go back to the Holy Land Foundation trial in 2008. I have the letter, and I'm sure you do too, from the FBI to, I believe it's at that time, to Senator John Kyle, dated 2009. Wherein they supposedly cut off all, the words in the letter, formal contact with CAIR, the Council on American Islamic Relations, which, when I read that letter, I hearken back to some of the bureaucratic language that I was familiar with in the FBI. You know, who judges what is formal, okay? And to look at the awards that you refer to that were given before and after that letter to jihadis,
Yes.
By my own organization.
Yes, it's true. Comey was giving community service awards to people that had high levels of derogatory information in our own database. They were doing outreach with Vali, the imam of the Boston Islamic Center, for 4 years before the marathon bombings happened. And I don't think Vali really realized, Imam Vali from ISB, that he spilled the beans big time, because he was being interviewed right after the Boston Marathon bombing. And he said, how could we be a radical organization when the FBI and DHS and national security agencies are having outreach and dialogue with us? And that made me realize, once again, of many other examples, no wonder they weren't shutting them down. No wonder they weren't investigating. They weren't investigating them. They were having coffee and donuts with them.
We were giving them credibility.
Oh, yeah. Well, see, and then that reveals another infection in the system, is how come FBI didn't know any of the information that we had? It would have been, it'd take you like 2 minutes, as fast as you can type, Islamic Society of North America, push enter, to find all this derogatory information. It wasn't buried somewhere in the archives in the basement of the Smithsonian. It was right on the main system. It would have, and then, you know, so it tells you it was a spectacular, preposterous level of breakdown and myopia, deliberate. It had to be.
You mentioned last week that I think you maybe have conducted some training for the Atlanta FBI office, or maybe for some specific agents. I'm asking you here, was that during your tenure, or was that after your retirement?
Oh, no. I had a lot of interaction with the FBI when I was active duty. They came and watched my interviews. And they would say things to my chain of command like, I learned more in 2 hours with Mr. Haney than I have in my whole previous career. Now, that's a nice compliment in a way, but on the other hand, if these are the agents that you have in the field doing counterterrorism, and they're telling you that they learn more in 2 hours than they have in their entire previous career. Well, thanks for the compliment, but that sort of makes me nervous, to tell you the truth. Why? Because how in the world could you go through a whole career and now tell me that all of this is, new to you? And then, if that wasn't bad enough, if that was really the case, then why didn't you guys make an arrangement for us to spend more time together? If you really thought that was the case, then from cop to cop, you should have set it up so we could, do some exchanging, some teaching and some,
Right.
But no, that was always stopped. They tried at least maybe 3 times, at least twice, while I was at Atlanta, to set up a liaison, a field level liaison between CBP and the FBI office, which was right downtown Atlanta. And it never worked. It never got off the ground. There was always some genius reason why they couldn't do it. And it never went anywhere. I actually talked with the guys that were going to do it. I mean, literally standing right next to them, watching the traffic flow of the passengers coming in on the international flights, standing over next to the wall, talking to each other about doing this proposal, working together. And it never happened.
Can you address, let's say, the criticism that I might take from some of my own folks, that I'm downplaying any successes that have gone on during all this period of time by stopping certain terrorist attacks? Can you address that for a minute?
The fact that we've had successes just tells you that it's possible, which makes the fact that these policies continue, this myopia, all the more of an indictment. There really is no excuse for, if you're in this profession and you're not at a mastery of this subject, then that's an indictment against you, because that's your responsibility. If you don't feel motivated to do it, then get a different job, because that attitude is a fatal attitude. That will get you killed on the job. That's not what you call law enforcement situational awareness, is being content with a partial level of engagement, is it?
That's a good way to put it. Yep.
No, you got to pretend like this is incoming fire. If you want to illustrate it, you don't walk around with an armored vest on the front but nothing in behind and say, well, that's good enough, I'll just face the incoming fire and we'll call that good. And besides that, it's also selfish as far as, I thought you were part of a team. Why is this so much always oriented in my career and advancement and survival? What did you take the oath for? To preserve and protect and uphold our Constitution and defend us from threat, both foreign and domestic. Are you really and truly doing all that you could or can? Or are you allowing yourself to become complacent and be content with some, but not serious about the full measure? That will get you killed. It's already gotten people killed, hasn't it?
Yes, sir.
And if somebody says, well, Haney, you're exaggerating. What do you mean? Who do you think you are? You could have helped stop San Bernardino. Well, if you're a cop and you don't think you can help stop crime or in terrorism, then why are you even in the job? Is that boasting to think or believe or operate on the point of view that you can help stop it? If you don't believe that, you shouldn't be in this business. It's not boasting to say that you can help stop it. You're supposed to. That's what your job is.
Yep.
I have FOIA responses to FOIA, letters that were sent to me by the 3 agencies that shut the cases down, that they can't respond to the FOIA request because they have no evidence that the Tablighi Jamaat case ever existed at all. And imagine they would have gotten away with that if it hadn't been for the fact that I had actually kept all the evidence of it. This is how bad we are. Entire agencies, not random and arbitrary, but the very ones that actually shut the cases down, now come back and tell me with signed letters that, sorry, we can't comply with your FOIA request because we have no evidence that the case ever existed at all. Now that, my friend, is a real serious problem. You're looking at Soviet-style changing of history. Oh, that's an exaggeration. Oh, really? You saw them do it right in front of us with Benghazi. They changed the narrative in real time. I'm not talking months, weeks, days, or hours. They did it in minutes. They were changing the narrative in real time as they presented it to the American people. That's how bad it is. They have the capacity to actually create an entirely false narrative and do it in real time. And if it weren't for people like me, they would be getting away with it more than they are, because there'd be nobody to contradict them at all.
Thank you for watching, ladies and gentlemen. Phil Haney will expound further in the part 2 interview as to more specifics about who the they was that he refers to in part 1 that was involved in going after him and his colleagues. I will comment further as to Phil's death at the end of the part 2 interview. Thanks again.